Today, we had a spring statement. It definitely wasn't a budget. And after the figures that came out, Rachel Reeves won't want to be calling it a forecast either. It was being described as a return to austerity, and rumours were flying about an attack on ISAs. Today, we're going to go through the growth forecasts a bit. I then want to look at spending and give you an overview of where that's at the minute and where it's been, so you can understand kind of why the tax burden in the UK is one of the highest it's ever been, yet everything still feels a little bit crap. And then we'll look at your ISAs. Let's start with growth. The OBR, or Office for Budget Responsibility, published this report, where they look to forecast the direction of the UK economy in the coming months. The headline is that they've slashed the growth estimates for the UK, measured by real GDP growth, they call it. So that's GDP growth after you adjust for the impacts of inflation, and GDP is all of the services and goods produced within a country within a given period. And then they adjust it for inflation. They've slashed that down to 1% for 2025, when in October last year, they forecasted that it would be 2%. In a recent interview with Sky News, Rachel Reeves said this.
I'm not going to preempt the Office of Budget Responsibility's forecast, but the world has changed.
The good news is we don't need to preempt now because we have it, but the narrative that the Chancellor will be keen to push is that the growth forecast is being slashed as a result of external factors, the world changing. The OBR breaks this down themselves. For example, European gas prices have risen, an external factor. But the OBR has also made a very crucial and interesting distinction in the paper between what they call cyclical and structural weaknesses, placing 1/3 of the lower growth forecast on these structural components. Cyclical weaknesses are potentially temporary factors. Higher interest rate expectations might be one, increases in gas prices, just elevated uncertainty around the globe because of wars, American politics. There's this argument that that will eventually pass. It'll get replaced by new stuff, no doubt. But that things like those are temporary and that policy can impact them. You know, for example, raising or lowering interest rates or stimulus. Good old stimulus. Whereas structural weaknesses suggest that the UK has embedded issues. And the OBR are saying that 1/3 of their downgrade is because they believe that those embedded issues are worse than they thought. The OBR thinks these embedded issues are concentrated in productivity. And they have a whole section that looks at this trend in productivity. But some interesting insights and slightly baffling data. The ONS revised up the total population and total hours worked by more than they revised up GDP. So try and wrap your head around this for a second. In 2024, the Office for National Statistics came out and said, we found an extra 500,000 people in the UK that we didn't think were here. Basically higher net migration figures once all of the numbers had settled. They then said, GDP's also gone up, but not by as much as we'd expect if we had an extra 500,000 workers. So we found 500,000 people, but we didn't find 500,000 people's worth of work. What that means is we know that the UK workforce is less productive than we thought. And what that means is for future projections, we have to downgrade how productive we think the workforce is. The ONS revised up the total population and total hours worked by more than the revised up GDP, lowering the level of productivity. Another baffling part of this is the OBR's future forecasts. So just a reminder, in the space of 6 months, we found a Sheffield's worth of people, and we now know that that means that the productivity of everyone in the UK is lower than we thought it would be. So growth forecasts in the UK will be lower. That's the difference from this yellow bar to this blue bar here. But don't worry, after 2026, we think that actually we will grow more than our previous forecasts. On what basis they can be confident with that forecast, I don't know. But if the OBR are correct and we have this structural issue with growth, the cyclical stuff can be fixable through time or monetary policy, but productivity problems that are structural, that are embedded, require fundamental reforms to things like education, infrastructure, innovation, and business regulation. Now let's look at spending, because that is central to that sort of reform. The two headlines around spending will be cuts to welfare and increased promises around defence spending. But I want to look at spending a bit more broadly, as I think it gives us an idea of the challenges we face. What I've put together here is a breakdown of spending in the UK over time based on this IFS data set. So we're looking at critical public spending. I'm not saying missing areas are not important, but there are lots of smaller categories, and these are just some of the biggest. So you have the actual amount that was spent at the time, what percentage that is of spending listed here, because that really demonstrates our shifting priorities over time. Notice how health spending has ballooned from 12% in the 70s to 23% of the spending here today. And it's implied that that's still not enough. Whereas defence spending has shrunk, and as we've pointed to, that's going to need to increase again. So the money's going to come from somewhere. At the end here, I've made a calculation. And what that calculation does is it adjusts in real terms the spending. So I've done the calculation from both 1997 to 2023 and 2008 to 2023. So that number tells us if that amount we're spending today is an increase or decrease in billions in real terms. The IFS data only extends to 2023 because, as we saw before, the numbers are constantly being revised and changed, so they count these figures as sort of locked in. The two biggest increases here in real terms are health spending, which is the direct impact of events like COVID and also an ageing population. If there are savings here to be made from efficiency, really I'm in no position to comment, but Labour certainly thinks so. Scrapping NHS England points to the view that they think a large chunk of this spending is non-essential. But this increase in the NHS in real terms has sucked money away from other areas. The other elephant in the room sucking up everything is debt interest. It's the worst kind of spending because we just get nothing for it. In inflation-adjusted terms, we're spending an extra $55 billion a year on our debt payments than we were in 2007-2008. Since then, we've had the financial crisis, COVID, and the energy crisis, which has piled on debt. But that bill there is one of the key issues, again, sucking up public spending and taking from other areas. 1/4 of the debt as well is linked to the rate of inflation, which means it gets more expensive if the inflation rate goes up. And that rate of inflation is set to increase again according to the Bank of England, so it could go up further. You may be surprised to see that pensioners' social security, so state pension spending, is down in real terms. I wasn't expecting to see that. I think what's happened here is between 2007 and 2008, we saw the introduction of rules that meant women had their state pension age match men's, and that saved the government around $5 billion a year. Also, there's been increases in the state pension age over that period, warping the figures over time. If we look at this chart that plots real changes in spending, we can see that between 2008 and 2023, state pension growth in real terms was pretty flat, and then it's kicked up here at the end. But in this context of growth and the productivity problem in the UK from the OBR, the red on this table to me points to obvious issues. How can we expect to become more productive as a nation when education spending is going backwards by such an amount? The red items here have emerged after 2008 as a result of the austerity between 2010 and 2019. The big question is then, if you need more money, where are you going to get it from? We can cut, we can tax, or we can grow the economy. We've cut, as we've shown through austerity in the past. We've taxed workers and businesses, especially recently, to the highest tax burden now since World War II. It's about 45% of GDP. And growing the economy, which would fix everything, seems pretty elusive, doesn't it? So yeah, where does the money come from? If we look at the table breakdown from the spring statement document that accompanies the speech, we can see where Rachel thinks that she will get the money from. Increased staff for both tax and welfare to collect on fraud and missing payments. We have to take these figures with such a pinch of salt though. Notice how they go, oh, we'll get 45 million extra in this year and then 570 million in year 6. All of that helps her projections and forecasts look better. We can see large cuts to welfare here across the board, promising to raise billions. If we come back to the table that I compiled again, then welfare cuts have been persistent in real terms. And Sky think that 50,000 children could be pushed into poverty by these measures. If we come back to that long-term productivity objective of the UK, this paper from the National Library of Medicine points to the fact that poverty affects long-term productivity due to poor diet impacting development, both physically and mentally, not to mention lower quality education associated with poverty, which as we know is the case across the board because of the real decline in education spend. There is a line in here that is simply reshaping the state to be more productive and agile, which is very vague. They're expecting to save 1.3 billion a year in year 4, up to 6 billion a year by year 6. I feel like these promises can't be grounded in any sense of reality when in 6 months we've halved the growth prospects for the year because we miscounted the population. Around spending here, it states that the government will spend more on infrastructure, housing and defence. And to be fair, the OBR significantly revised their house building expectations. So this dotted line was the previous forecast, and this solid line here is where they expect house building to go now. If I had to summarise this spring statement, it would just be one big exercise in moving numbers around. Oh, we've discovered an extra 500,000 people, so now we're going to chop this number over here. And then Rachel Reeve goes, well, that's going to affect my number, so I'm going to move some things around here so I can stick to my fiscal rules that I love so much. There was so much speculation around ISAs leading up to this, including this fear that they were going to change the ISA allowances, specifically around cash ISAs. There was actually something around ISA rules buried in the 50-page document that accompanies the speech. The government is looking at options of reforms to individual savings accounts to get the balance right between cash and equities to earn better returns for savers, boost the culture of retail investment and support the growth mission alongside this. The government is working closely with the Financial Conduct Authority to deliver a system of targeted support to give people the confidence to invest. This coincides with the FCA, the UK finance regulator, announcing that they will encourage greater investment and risk-taking by UK savers. I went looking for what that means, and they released this yesterday. but it doesn't seem that connected with this discussion. One rumoured change would be around advertising and how brokers can promote their stocks and shares ISAs to their cash ISA customers. It isn't a change yet, it leans more towards the regulator changing how they're going to operate and interact with these sorts of products and messaging. I think one thing that they could do is stop scaring the life out of people every time investment is discussed by forcing there to be risk warnings on everything that, make it sound like you're going to lose all your money all the time. They could be better balanced with that. But anyway, there's no changes yet, but they haven't been ruled out and the wording is quite vague. So I think we're going to have to wait until, the budget later in the year, the proper budget, the full fat one, before we get a steer on this. I think, what will happen is leading up to that, speculation will be rife. And my advice, if you want to call it that, is don't react to speculation. Don't make financial plans on the unknown. Only deal with really what's in front of you. But yeah, I'll see you soon.